Hi, my name is Liz O'Neill and I am Coordinator of Healing here at the Church of the Resurrection. You're listening to the first of 3 talks in the formation course which is entitled Holiness and Wholeness. This talk will deal with the results of past wounds, suffering in our lives, how we cope with those things, and what impact that can have on us spiritually. Throughout this short course we'll be exploring the way that suffering can lead to sinfulness in our lives, and more importantly, what we can do about that through healing prayer, accessing the sacrament of reconciliation, and renouncing lies. The most important takeaway from this talk is that the true aim of healing prayer is personal holiness. Wholeness and holiness are the same thing in heaven. I'm not a therapist or a counsellor, so I'm not qualified to talk about trauma or neglect from a professional point of view. My qualifications are the same as everyone else listening to this talk. I'm a human being living in the 21st century. To speak personally for a moment, yesterday was the 24th of April, and that is an important anniversary for me because it's the anniversary of the death of my older brother. When I was 10 years old, my beloved big brother died of cancer. His death was probably the most important moment of or event of my childhood. In fact, it probably marked the end of my childhood. I'm sure many people who have had experiences like that will resonate with me saying that. My own healing journey takes me back time and time again to that time in my life. It shaped me. There were many blessings that came out of that experience. I learned that I believed passionately in God and that my whole purpose on this earth was to get to heaven. In the last few years, however, as I've embarked on my own healing journey, I've been able to accept that alongside the blessings of that time, there are still wounds that come from those childhood experiences. I've been able to invite God into the memories, which, for example, left me with the deep anxieties about health and many inner vows or promises about trying to protect those that I love from any kind of suffering. It's an ongoing journey for me. I am an English teacher by profession, so rather than use real life stories in the interests of confidentiality, I am going to use characters from a couple of my favourite books to illustrate some of the things that I'm going to talk about. As we look together at this topic, I invite you, as you listen, to open your heart to the Spirit of God speaking in you about your own healing journey and your personal history. Take note of when something is stirring in your heart. I want to begin with a couple of questions that come up when we are talking about healing in the parish. The first one is, are modern people less robust emotionally and psychologically than the generations that went before them? Do we need healing more than previous generations? And the second connecting question is it harder to be holy nowadays? The first question of whether we need healing more is quite interesting, isn't it? Physically, we are better off than our ancestors, I think. I am recording this in the middle of April 2020 on lockdown because of the coronavirus, so I say that with a pinch of salt, but hopefully that's just a blip. Let's just say that unlike our ancestors, we do not expect untimely death. We have a longer life expectancy. Emotionally and psychologically, on the other hand, there is evidence that we are more in need of what might be called inner healing. It's said that 1/4 of all the visits made to general or family physicians ends in a prescription for anxiety medication. Why is that? It's a favourite device of science fiction movies to have a character hooked up to a feed of news of all the tragedies and outrages, wars and disasters suffered by humanity. Image after image, usually from the 20th century, pours into their minds. And it's at the very least deeply troubling, or sometimes it even sends them into madness. Sometimes it seems as if modern life is just a slow feed of horrifying news. There's a reason why St. Paul told the Philippians And this is a verse that my husband Sean frequently has to encourage me to read. Whatever is true, whatever is honourable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious, if there is any excellence and if there is any praise, think about these things. So my answer to the question of whether we are more in need of inner healing than our ancestors is probably yes. At any rate, we are not in need of it less. The second question, is it harder to be holy nowadays? Only God alone knows if we are more sinful than previous generations. There are certainly many disadvantages to our times. We're exposed to values that undermine our faith. We are exposed to temptations that our ancestors would have shuddered at. And all around us we see evidence of brokenness which seems unprecedented. I'll leave it to you to decide the answer to both of these questions. I would prefer to focus on what God is doing to help us right now in the situation in which we find ourselves. I like to take the approach of G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton wrote a book called What's Wrong with the World? And he was asked by a reporter or a journalist to sum up what the answer would be, and he famously said that what was wrong with the world was, he said, I am what's wrong with the world. We are what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with me? Let's look at our personal woundedness and the way that this might be stopping us from progressing in the spiritual life. Consider how this might have begun in your own childhood, for example. First, let me say something important. There are many bad things which happen in our early lives which bear good fruit. How many wonderful charities and ministries have been born out of the suffering of an individual or a family? So many good things can come out of hardship and suffering, character building, an increase in virtue and endurance. How many saints have turned to God in the middle of the most awful hardships in their lives, and so forth and so on. It seems like God uses suffering and can redeem it. So I am very aware of that. I'm not going to talk about that kind of suffering much today. It would seem that all suffering is allowed by God in order that it might be that kind of redemptive suffering. And hopefully what I can talk about is how we might approach the suffering in our life that has not been redeemed and bring that into that area of light. Okay, I promised you some literature, so I want to talk a little bit about two characters from a favourite childhood novel, Treasures of the Snow. Treasures of the Snow is set in Switzerland, I think between World War I and World War II. And the story centres around two children of about age 11 who end up hating and fearing one another and hurting one another. One is a boy called Lucien, has no father, and who deals with resentment and shame that's come out of the hardships of his family. And the other is Annette, who has no mother, but is confident in herself, although a bit judgmental. True to form, Lucien deals with his unhappiness by bullying Annette's little brother, injuring him much more seriously than he means. He's found out, ostracised by the villagers and the other school children, something which Annette fully supports and somewhat organises. Annette's godly grandmother tells her she must forgive Lucien. Annette attempts to pray in forgiveness for Lucien, but discovers that the forgiveness disappears when she observes her brother's continued health problems from the incident with Lucien. Annette hurts Lucien in the only way she can find, by smashing a little horse that he has painstakingly carved for a competition. This simple story illustrates just how wounds impact our behaviour. The pain we suffer without redemption often fuels us in hurting others or ourselves. The fruit of these wounds in our lives come out at the oddest of times and in ways that we really don't want. Time passes, we forget some of the things that have happened to us. Time, it is said, is a great healer, but there is someone who is a much more effective healer, and that's Jesus himself. Ask yourself, am I carrying wounds that Jesus wants to heal? I'm going to look at two different results that come out of traumatic experiences which might be continuing to affect us and pull us down. The first area I'm going to look at is inner vows, or unhelpful promises that we have made to ourselves that come out of suffering. These are not free decisions, but they're wrung out of us in pain. They are rather like a hidden brake that we've left on in our car. Yes, I do know what it's like to try and drive your car and the brake is still on. But you know what I'm talking about. It's that desire to do something good that just seems to not be able to move forward. It's that moment where we go to do something and realise we can't do it. Let me go back again to literature to examine ways that inner vows work in people. Charles Dickens' novel, Great Expectations. I can't imagine there are many writers who understand the way that human beings are shaped by their childhood as well as Dickens does. So I'm going to focus on two characters from the novel. The central character, Pip, and his foster father, Joe Gargery. Pip is the youngest child of a couple who die before he's old enough to remember them. You'll remember if you've read the novel that the opening chapter has him trying to work out what his parents were like from the shape of the letters on their tombstone. Pip is being raised by his only surviving close relative, his older sister. She is an abusive, angry woman who makes Pip's life a misery. She's married to Joe Gargery, a simple blacksmith whom she also bullies. Pip is constantly trying to escape from his sister's clutches, and when an escaped convict captures him in the graveyard and threatens to kill him if he doesn't steal food and drink for him, he readily capitulates. It's clear that he does not think that the adults in his life are the kind of people that you can go to for help. Whether that's an inner vow or just a recognition of the truth, I don't know, but he doesn't ask them for help. Pip has two abiding wounds, at least, that come from his childhood: rejection and shame. Anyone who reads the novel and doesn't understand, which people who read the novel frequently don't, why Pip would desperately want to be loved by a cold and cruel and broken Estella, another orphan who's being raised by a cruel parent, or why he should be so anxious at all costs to be considered a gentleman, doesn't understand the way that inner vows are driving Pip. What do you think they might be? That's your homework for today. His foster father Joe, the gentle blacksmith, who does not protect Pip either from his sister's attacks or from the manipulative behaviour of other characters in the novel. Joe has some insight into his own inner vows, and in fact he actually tries to explain to Pip, by way of asking for pardon, what they are. Joe reveals to him that his own mother was horribly bullied and beaten by his father, and that out of fear of doing that himself as a husband, he's privately vowed never to behave in such a way to a woman. In fact, he's gone too far in abdicating any reasonable intervention he could have made. How many of us have vowed never to be like our parents, only to find we have erred in the opposite and equally damaging way with our children? Dickensian childhoods aside, all of us have experienced traumas in this fallen world which have shaped us for good or ill. There's a second type of childhood suffering which is more difficult to identify, and that is neglect or the absence of good things that we needed to grow or thrive. We may not have had much of the affirmation or attention that we really needed. We may have missed out on many things that are difficult to quantify. It's even harder to access this sort of hurt, also when it's something that was not meant for our ill. The breakdown of our parents' marriage, or the absence of a parent through illness or a demanding job, can impact us, what we believe about ourselves. We often try to explain that away. It is nobody's fault, these things happen, others had it much worse than me, and so on. One of the key ways we can receive healing and also spiritual good health is to look carefully at our own suffering and identify certain things that came from it. A couple of wonderful questions to use. The first question: What do I believe about myself as a result of these experiences? They're often good beliefs, but mixed in with them, the tares amongst the wheat, mixed in with them, we often have lies that we believe about ourselves. Lies like, I'm not good enough, there was something wrong with me, I'll never have what I want, I am alone, and so forth. Second question, what do I believe about those who hurt me or let me down? We may understand those who've hurt us very well, but carrying around that judgment of them is often damaging to our very souls. Before I talk about what we can do to receive healing for these two sets of personal beliefs, let me look at another area that can be helpful in locating our wounds, our habitual sins. Yeah, I really did say that. It can be helpful to look at our habitual sins. This is one of the key things about confession. They are clues to where we're wounded, and they're an excellent reason for us to pursue healing. You're probably familiar with the 7 deadly sins. I'm going to use a description of each of them that Dr. Bob Schutz of the John Paul II Healing Centre, who's been such an inspiration to us in the parish here, uses. Obviously each sin is more complex than I'm presenting it today, but for the purposes of some personal reflection on the relationship between wounds and sin, let me just give you this definition. Allow yourself to consider whether these sins are still active in your life and where they might be rooted. The first sin, pride, the gateway sin. St. Augustine said it was the first sin, the beginning of all others. Think of this one as an idolatry of ourselves. Key to identifying it are things like self-righteousness, self-deception, self-promotion. It often manifests itself as a deep self-reliance. Many of us who've experienced abandonment struggle with it. I am alone and I am my own God. Second sin, sloth. Sloth is the idolatry of ease and false comfort, laziness, giving up when things get difficult. One possible route into this, one wound, this may be a result of constant criticism in childhood. It's not going to be good enough, so I am not going to try. The sin of envy, the idolatry of position or status. Coveting what someone else has or bringing them down. Maybe that's the root of our sin of gossip or judgment of others, and it may have taken hold in us through deep self-rejection. Fourth sin, lust, the idolatry of sex or relationships and all of the sins that come from that. Lust, we know, is not a healthy desire for another person. It's a desire to take from another without giving anything of ourselves to use them. This one can be very complicated. But should you deal with this sin, ask yourself, why am I trying to deal with my pain by using others or by placing someone human before God? The sin of gluttony, idolatry of food, drink or drugs. Again, a sin of false comfort. Ask, what am I trying to comfort? Where is the pain or wound that makes me susceptible to this issue? When did it start? Sixth sin, greed. The idolatry of security, wealth or money. Sins which manifest this include hoarding, stealing or using other people to get ahead. Where does that come from? Many years ago, knew a man who could not cross the threshold of his own house without a significant amount of money in notes in his pocket. A desperately poor childhood had left him with a constant need to physically grasp money whenever he left the house. It was his security blanket. What a metaphor for the greed that we see around us. What is happening there in our society? What wounds are in us to do with security that are being lived out through greed? Final sin is the sin of anger. Anger is the idolatry of power, control, or justice. With this, we see bitterness, resentment, judgment, and retaliation. Wow. Psychologists tell us that depression is anger that has been repressed. It's like the good person's version of being angry. I'm not talking about righteous anger, obviously. Not helpful. Is that the root of the sadness that you feel? I hope this list is helpful to you. Think about how it might inform your next confession, and think about what you may need to receive by way of healing to help you in this struggle. Father Steve will talk more about this in a later talk. Okay, to conclude, I hope this exploration of childhood wounds, inner vows, and sin has been fruitful for you. If you're tempted, as many of us are, to say, past is gone, I don't dwell on it, it doesn't continue to affect me, take this to prayer and see if God might want to enter into your past with you. Come for prayer ministry and we will accompany you to the divine physician. His loving heart does not want you to suffer needlessly or to waste your suffering. He does want to break down the barriers between you and him, that you two might be made whole. In heaven, holiness and wholeness are the same thing.